Dear Senator Broster, ladies and gentlemen, dear Mike Savage, I would like to welcome you most warmly to today's event and to the award ceremony in the context of the Siegfried Landshut-Prize 2022, which goes to Professor Dr. Mike Savage. The Siegfried Landshut Prize, which has been established in 2018, commemorates the German Jewish political scientist Siegfried Landshut, who was expelled from Hamburg in Germany by the Nazi regime in 1933 and who returned to Hamburg and to the University of Hamburg in the early 1950s in order to, among other things, rebuild and reconstruct the discipline of political science. The prize, however, is not intended to commemorate the exile or the suffering in exile of a particular personality. Rather, the prize is awarded to recall the work of Siegfried Landshut, which, still unrecognized, has much to say to us today because of the oftentimes heterodox ways of his thinking and the interdisciplinary approach that characterizes his oeuvre. Landshut's oeuvre is exemplary for us at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research in many respects. And quite logically, the Siegfried Landshut Prize was then also awarded to academics and scholars whose research we admire and to whom we want to give increased attention with a prize. In 2018, 2019, 2020, and 21, these were the sociologists Michael Mann and George Steinmetz, the historian Isabel Hall, and the sociologist Marion Fourcade. The 22 prize is awarded today to British sociologist Mike Savage, whose impressive work we wish to celebrate. We are pleased and feel very much honored that Senator Dr. Carsten Broster will, now one could say as always, start the Landshut Prize ceremony by giving a welcome address. Luca Kokol, a member of the research group on monetary sovereignty here at the Institute, will say a few words about the content of the prize before Professor Dr. Monika Krause, sociologist and co-director of the LSE Human Rights in London, will then give the laudatory speech for Mike Savage. Finally, of course, the laureate will speak on the topic of what are the challenges of inequality in the 21st century. Afterwards, and if there is time, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. But right now, I would like you to listen to Dr. Carsten Broster's welcome address. Please.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction, dear Professor Savage. It's always a pleasure to be at this incident because it gives me the opportunity to a little bit hijack the idea of a welcome address, because welcoming address just means great that you are here, nice that you have me here, and now let's proceed with what is going on. And just share a few thoughts on the topic I think that the laureate might have in mind. I'm not sure about this, but it gives a politician the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper than we usually do in the shallow work of our everyday lives. And so please forgive me if I try to do this once again, because I found the topic of your research so interesting and so relevant to our discourses and to our analysis of society at the moment that I just couldn't resist. In November 2022, Oxfam published a study entitled Carbon Billionaires, the Investment Emission of the World's Richest People. The core finding was that on average, the 125 richest billionaires each emit 3 million tons of CO2. That is more than 1 million times as much as the emissions of someone in the lower 90% of the world's population. How climate protection interlocks with inequality can be seen in this study. The study combined in a very effective manner the debates of climate protection and on inequality, and for this reason received a great deal of media attention. The revelations about the super rich and the fact that they are climate sinners was a good story for the media, and people quickly began to criticize the lavish lifestyles of those billionaires. The media reports were full of their climate arrogance, their lack of flight shame, their mentality of I don't care about the future after my lifetime. Commentators calculated the greenhouse gas emissions of private jets and assessed the consequences for the real estate market of penthouse apartments that were empty for much of the year. This kind of criticism is certainly justifiable, even though it misses the point even of this study, because what Oxfam actually stated was, quote, that the world's richest people emit huge and unsustainable amount of carbon and, unlike ordinary people, 50 to 70% of their emissions result from their investments. So the issue is not only the more or less lavish lifestyle of the richest people in the world, it is their environmentally unfriendly investments in oil and cement industries, for example. They own large shares of global companies and are thus in a position to influence their policies. Or another example that the German innovation scholar Maya Göpel described in 2019 when she was saying that at the United Nations where she was, and she was talking about the fact that $39 billion are needed to enable all children in the school to go to school, on the earth to go to school, whereas at the same moment, just a few yards away, the JP Morgan Bank had issued a statement that it was going to pay $40 billion dividend to its shareholders. So just a few blocks away, on one hand, the assessment, we need $39 billion in order to educate every child that there is on earth, and just a couple of blocks away, a bank saying, well, I'll give $40 billion to all of our shareholders. Those are the examples of inequality that shape our planet at the moment and that we have to tackle also as a political issue if we want to deal with this. And of course, these big cleavages go all the way down into the core fabric of our societies. And it is, of course, to some extent a question of what individuals do, though on a different level. The notorious 1% wield unimaginable power. A small group has come from nowhere, presumably, and in socioeconomic and cultural terms, it is unlike any of the other groups in our societies. And the trend is intact. I don't know who of you watched the, I think, very recommendable TV show, a Netflix show from Barack Obama just a couple of weeks ago, Work, where he was going all the way through different aspects of everyday working life of Americans, starting with people cleaning the house all the way up to the top of the guys owning not just the house, but the company that owns all the houses. And there's one very small and tiny incident where he, in the first episode, where he was talking about the lowest in the workforce and talking to them and asking them, well, why do you go to work? And there was a woman who was working for a daycare for elderly people, and she was saying, well, actually, all I want to do is I want to sit on my porch in my rocking chair in the evening. I want to know that I can support my children. I want to know that I can pay my bills and then have a rest in the evening. And just 3 episodes later, he's on the porch of somebody working in an artificial intelligence company who's leading a team, who's doing all the way up his career, who's in his mid-40s presumably, has a wife, children, and he's complaining about not having enough sense of responsibility, sense of necessity in what he's doing, and that he has to change his job because he doesn't feel what he's actually working about. And so this is one of the aspects that link socioeconomic to cultural terms, and that of course is very closely linked to Turkel's study Working from the 1970s, where this aspect of telling the story of everyday working lives people is still very much intact. And then there has, of course, been at the end a stupendous increase in capital accumulation. The 1% on the top are decoupling themselves, whereas the pressure everywhere else is on the rise. And in cities, this is especially noticeable. Here, people from all kinds of backgrounds coexist, though they are often confronted by very different and specific challenges. In particular, there's the question of who can still afford to live in a large metropolis nowadays, for this may determine whether an individual can make use of the various participation opportunities that are in the cities. And Fran Lebowitz, who's living in New York for most of her life, once said, well, it was always impossible to live in New York. Even when I moved here in the 80s, it was impossible to afford New York, but now it really is impossible. She doesn't understand how young people do it, although she couldn't explain how she did it when she moved there. In Germany, not so very long ago, and in cases of this kind, we used to speak not only of a social milieu, but also of distinct classes. And Mike Savage still does that. And it's a British tradition to do that, one that is got a little lost in Germany, where it has this Marxist undertone, and in a country that was deeply divided in a democratic and a not so democratic part that was influenced by at least one line of tradition of Marxism. It is only found today in historical research or sometimes in rather ironic and lightweight analysis. But British sociology has never stopped using it. And even in the US, it is still used in everyday life. You have the working class, you have the middle class, just as very vibrant, very relevant concepts of the discussion about what is going on in society. Whereas in Germany, we sometimes tend to shift the debate a little too obviously into the sphere of aesthetics and of culture, where in fact economic distribution is of decisive importance. Even when someone like the historian Paul Nolte a couple of years ago spoke about Unterschichtenfernsehen, like lower strata television, it was coming from a basically neoconservative train of thought, not from a socialist or from a progressive perspective, but on one that was doing the distinction from the top to the bottom and not doing the identity of the bottom in order to change the fabric of our society. So the sociological and analytical term almost seems to have acquired a neoconservative and sometimes discriminatory meaning. Max Savage shows the extent to which the term class is now dependent on cultural and bureaucratic concepts. But he also marks the limits of this perspective and stresses the unchanged importance of socioeconomic data. He discusses the numerous kinds of distinction in our societies and assigns them to concepts of class which neither lose sight of basic needs nor accept them as the one and only criterion. The various kinds of friction in our society and the internal social cleavages can only become visible and be dealt with on the basis of a multi-perspective analysis. Membership of a class is multidimensional, and to define it solely on the basis of income is simply insufficient. Somebody who's selling glasses in Görlitz may actually, in the end, earn as much as a skilled worker in Hamburg. But do they share the same life? Do they share the same class experience? Most certainly they do not. They both include in the widely visible middle class, but that is no useful purpose in order to understand what they're going through in their everyday life. We need to dig a little bit deeper. Conversely, I often wished, for example, during the pandemic, that the artists, and since I'm the Senator for Culture and Media, those were the ones that I had to deal with a lot, would understand that their social and their economic position in society is not so different from the guys that actually delivered the parcels from home shopping during the same time, not being steadily employed, depending on a very shakeable income, but yet still striving for distinction on cultural issues instead of combining their interests in socioeconomic terms, struggling and fighting for better social justice, for better social inclusion in the welfare state and its fabric and its system. It's, for example, that Levitsky and Ziblatt in their study on how democracies die actually plead in the end to politicians to find the issues that go across and beyond these cultural differences, like housing, like education, like social justice, like being able to live a decent life once you're unemployed and once you're not in the workforce anymore. And those are issues that do not have that much to do in the end with what we actually culturally differentiate ourselves to in groups, but have an underlying integrative train of thought and also pose a political question that we need to answer in order to hold those societies together. A class is shaped and molded by many of its components, by financial opportunities, by cultural capital, and as Mike Savage has shown again and again in his research, by spatial inequalities and the associated social mobility. And since the publication of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st century, it has also become clear that large amounts of wealth are simply being inherited. So there is not merit that is the argument for your position in society, but actually the question where you were born and what you inherit. They are not the product of work. Thus, financial and social inequality is also based on a kind of historical determinism, and this is something which inequality research needs to study in greater detail in order to enable politicians and in order to enable us as societies to deal with this and to even change this in order to make our societies more equal and hopefully more just. Here again, Mike Savage is a pioneer. His research displays a high level of sensibility and attentiveness to the historical forces that have shaped both sociological research methods and terminology, and also the subsequent definition of what is actually being studied. He calls this the weight of the past, and has used the phrase as part of the subtitle of his latest book, The Return of Inequality. Max Savage research asks us to confront the forthcoming challenges of our society and points to the sociological links between them. Without precise understanding of the ever-increasing class differences and the ever greater intra-societal cleavages, we will find neither a solution for the climate crisis nor for the future of our democracy, which, whether we like it or not, is based on common decisions and values. And there was a very interesting article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany in 2016, right after Donald Trump won the election in the United States. And the question that the author poses, I don't know if anyone of you read this, was, had Hillary Clinton heard Bruce Springsteen's Youngstown, the song that he wrote a couple of years ago about a former steel worker from Youngstown, Ohio, exactly the ones that she was talking about when she was talking about the deplorables, the ones that were to be deplored in the US. Had she heard this song, might she have won the election because she understood how she needed to address people who have a different way of life and a different understanding of everyday life than she has herself, and she had herself the way that she was brought up and the way that she was living now. Because there's the story of somebody who still cannot stand the idea of doing anything else but living and working in a steel mill, living and working in a blast furnace. Not impossible to think of anything else. And if we don't understand that there are people, I'm coming from the rural region in Germany, so I kind of know these people that Bruce Springsteen was singing about. If we don't understand them, we're just looking at them from the metropolises and our cultural and artsy everyday life, we will not understand what they actually need and what they demand from our societies. Not for us to talk like them, not for us to make them believe that their way of living is right, but actually engaging in a respectful discussion with them, trying to find out what is the society that we want to live in together across all the differences that we have in our societies. And of course, there is a social conflict when the richer classes of our society ask people not to do things they would like to do. People who fly on holidays 4 times annually can easily give up 2 trips a year. But people who only go to the Baltic Sea once every 2 years will find it far more difficult to understand such exhortations. Journalist Anna Meyer has described such decision-making junctures in her very readable book, Die Elenden, The Wretched. And she writes there about this idea of giving things up for lower classes. If renunciation is a moral value, then we are going to make it even more difficult for the poor to feel that they belong to this society. For they wish to have all the things which they are supposed to be giving up. The people who preach the gospel of giving up something which they themselves have enjoyed countless times now tells others, air travel is not really as good as you think, you do not need it, and once again become decision makers on account of their greater financial resources. This goes hand in hand with moral superiority, for after all, their conduct is helping to save the planet. So when we want to tackle one of the big issues like climate change, we also need to frame it as a social question. We cannot differentiate these two. And it's not just about moral, it's not just about making it about individual choices, it's about actually dealing with the social stratification of our societies and go into the structure and go into the socio-economical and political economical questions that tend to belong with this. And that was what the modern welfare state democracies did in the 20th century when they tackled inequality at that time. And that's what we need to do again when we talk about new forms of social inequality in the light of the current socio-ecological crises of nowadays. We will be able to resolve the climate issue in a meaningful and efficacious manner only if it is construed as a social issue. Here it may perhaps be useful to respond to the current culturalization of social conflicts with rather more robust sociological analysis of the societal dimension, and in doing so to own and restore the precision of the social science categories. Today, class struggle may no longer seem to be an issue. However, what we are talking about is definitely more than the mere differences between the various situations in which people find themselves. The depiction of social conflicts as an individual striving for uniqueness plays down the significance of the tasks that lie ahead. For this reason, I'm very pleased that the Hamburg Institute for Social Research has decided to give Mike Savage the 2022 Siegfried Landshut Award. This will also help to make people in German-speaking countries aware of his perspective research work. I congratulate you most warmly, Professor Savage, and now I look forward with great interest to the further speeches and especially your lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so I guess now it remains to me to proceed to the, well, not important bits because you will have the important bits later, but the substantial part of this evening, so to say. And I guess you've heard a little bit now about the work of Mike Savage, and you will certainly hear much more about that. So you will understand better why the honor comes to you. And this is literally the one important part of the content of this prize. It is obviously the honor that is dedicated to you. And it comes as well with a benefit that does not, strictly speaking, come to you directly, but is supposed to support younger scholars that are on their way, still trying to find out their spaces and with whom you are closely working with. So one of them is Marta Panini and the other one Maya Aderath. And both of these young scholars will have the opportunity to come here, join us at the Institute for a while, stay at the Institute, with the accommodation given. And this is supposed to be a moment of exchange between young scholars, between more advanced senior scholars, and is really supposed to give a greater or more substantial ground and exchange to engage with the different kinds of work, and in that way also with your work and the work that is happening at the Institute here. So we are very happy and also honored from our side for this mutual benefit here, so to say, or this mutual exchange. And I just want to quickly introduce a little bit the two scholars that will be coming to the Institute here. So both are PhD students in your department of sociology at the LSE. Marta Panini is someone who you are supervising yourself, and she's working on the historical process of legitimization of status hierarchies by the British state. And Maya Aderath is working on trade unions in context in the organizational form and universal welfare provision in the US and in the UK at the turn of the 20th century. And these, I think, are two works that obviously, for obvious reasons, relate to your work, but also match pretty much the profile of the HIS Institute, and we are very much looking forward to welcoming them to here, but also to foster greater engagements and exchange among the work. So thank you for that.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, sehr geehrter Herr Senator Broster, sehr geehrter Herr Knöbel, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, dear Mike Savage. Ich nehme an, unser Preisträger wird nachher über soziale Ungleichheit sprechen. Und auch im Sinne von Siegfried Landschuts Aufruf, Freiheit und Gleichheit in den Mittelpunkt der Soziologie zu stellen, ist Mike Savage natürlich ein äußerst würdiger Kandidat für die ihm heute zugewiesene Ehrung. Ich möchte aber behaupten, dass im Zentrum von Savages Arbeiten, ja, man kann bei ihm im Sinne eines eher deutschen, emphatischen Werkbegriffs sagen, im Zentrum seines Werks nicht eigentlich die Ungleichheit steht. Es lohnt sich ja nach so einem Zentrum zu fragen, auch und gerade bei jemandem, der so viel publiziert, der aber auch so viel fördert, so großzügig betreut und organisiert, der Denker ist und Forscher zugleich. Was treibt so jemand über die Jahrzehnte intellektuell an? Die Antwort auf die Frage nach dem Zentrum von Savages Werk, so will ich behaupten, lautet nicht Ungleichheit, auch nicht Klasse oder Kultur oder Fragen zur soziologischen Methode, schon gar nicht oder überhaupt nicht Pierre Bourdieu, sondern der soziale Wandel. Wenn dieser Fokus auf sozialen Wandel auf irgendeine Art und Weise verborgen ist, dann doch höchstens, wie man auf Englisch sagt, hidden in plain sight, also in aller Öffentlichkeit verborgen. Savage hat 3 Bücher geschrieben mit dem Begriff Social Change im Titel. Wenn man Social Transformation, Social Cultural Change und Urban Transformation dazu zählt, sind es mehr. Wenn man Artikel dazu zählt, sind es fast unzählige mehr. Nun ist der Begriff sozialer Wandel den meisten von uns, die wir heute hier versammelt sind, in einer bestimmten Weise vertrauter Begriff. Im Sinne einer kritischen Würdigung von Savages Werk, einer Würdigung also, die auch versucht, Abstand zu gewinnen, um besser zu sehen, die das Werk in den Mittelpunkt rückt, auch um es herumzugehen, damit sie es von verschiedenen Seiten betrachten kann, möchte ich den Begriff im Folgenden auch als etwas eigentlich Seltsames und Sonderbares hinstellen. Ich möchte darüber hinaus und dadurch zeigen, dass Savage in seiner Auseinandersetzung mit der Frage nach dem sozialen Wandel historische und soziologische Herangehensweisen verbindet. Genauer gesagt, ich möchte zeigen, wie Savage verschiedene, ausgewählte Teile des soziologischen und des historischen Repertoires immer wieder neu und schließlich meisterhaft, wie fast kein anderer, ja, ich traue mich zu sagen, wie gar kein anderer, zusammenfügt. Zu Biografie und Werdegang. Mike Savage ist in einem Randbezirk von London aufgewachsen, verbrachte dann aber die ersten 3 Jahrzehnte seines Lebens zumindest beruflich im Norden Englands. Savage absolvierte ein Geschichtsstudium an der Universität von York, gefolgt von einem Master in Social History an der Universität von Lancaster. Für die Promotion wechselte er dann in die Soziologie, wie er selbst geschrieben hat, auch, aber nicht nur wegen einem von dort angebotenen Stipendium. Er arbeitete unter der Supervision von Alan Ward an einer Dissertation über die Geschichte der Arbeiterbewegung in Preston, die 1987 unter dem Titel The Dynamics of Working Class Politics, The Labour Movement in Preston, 1880 to 1940 von Cambridge University Press veröffentlicht wurde. Nach Aufenthalten in Kiel und Sussex war er danach viele Jahre in Manchester, wo er das ESRC Center for Research on Social and Cultural Change leitete. Und seit 1914 ist er Professor der Soziologie an der London School of Economics, wo er unter anderem das International Inequalities Institute gegründet, geleitet und aufgebaut hat. Was meint also Savage mit sozialem Wandel? Erlauben Sie mir, mit einigen Bemerkungen darüber zu beginnen, was Michael Savage nicht mit sozialem Wandel meint. Er meint nicht die Evolution und wendet sich ganz explizit gegen teleologische Begriffe von sozialem Wandel. Er meint auch nicht die Revolution von Marx, die aber durch ihr Ausbleiben relevant bleibt. Er meint auch nicht die in Wanses Hypothesen übersetzten existenziellen Dilemmata, die bei Max Weber im Vordergrund stehen. Weil Savage auf Englisch schreibt und im Englischen von Social Change spricht, lohnt es sich vielleicht darauf hinzuweisen, dass er das Wort nicht auf Amerikanisch ausspricht. In den Vereinigten Staaten meint Social Change ja gerade, aber nicht nur auf der Linken gerade, aber nicht erst seit 1968 einfach Fortschritt. Man spricht auf Amerikanisch von Social Change Organizations, von Lasting Social Change, von Working Towards Social Change und meint damit eine Veränderung zum Besseren, die ohne problematische Nachteile in eine Richtung marschieren kann. Gegen all diese Bedeutungen zitiert Savage lieber Walter Benjamin, in dem Sinn, dass die Geschichte messy, also kompliziert und unübersichtlich ist und vor allem Verlierer kennt. Savage bezeichnet sich als ein Historiker, der Soziologe geworden ist, aber mit dem Fokus auf sozialen Wandel zeigt er sich nicht als Differenzhistoriker, als Historiker also, dem an sich daran gelegen ist, die Andersartigkeit der Vergangenheit in den Vordergrund zu stellen. Obwohl er Historiker bleibt, meint er mit sozialem Wandel meistens auch nicht die Weltgeschichte. Er meint nicht Ereignisse oder Katastrophen wie den Krieg oder Brüche wie auch den Krieg. Dazu ist er zu sehr Soziologe und lässt sich schon einmal dazu hinreißen, nach dem sozialen Wandel im Allgemeinen zu fragen. Vielleicht ist er dazu auch zu sehr Brite, das heißt, er stammt aus einem Kontext, wo die vermeintliche und zu einem gewissen Grad auch tatsächliche Kontinuität der Institutionen die ereignisvolle Geschichte als sowohl Oberfläche als auch Hintergrund erscheinen lässt. Sozialer Wandel ist für Savage auch Wertewandel, aber obwohl er sehr wohl in einem ganz traditionellen Sinn gelehrt ist, interessierte er sich nicht für Kultur an sich in einem starken Sinn. Savage bleibt nah an der Einheit Menschenleben. Er bleibt nah am Menschenleben in seiner zeitlichen Dimension und interessiert sich auch sehr für die Einheit Menschenleben in seiner räumlichen Dimension. Er interessiert sich für die Orte und die Landschaften, in denen das Leben stattfindet. Seine Analysen bleiben nah an den Sichtweisen und Entscheidungen der Menschen und sprechen mal mehr und mal weniger implizit auch zu Fragen nach ihren politischen Wahlentscheidungen und Orientierungen. Savage ist explizit beeinflusst von der marxistischen Sozialgeschichte. Weil er aber nicht immer optimistisch ist, erinnert dieser Fokus auf die Einheit Leben, auf die Einheit menschliches Leben an Jakob Burckhardts Diktum vom handelnden, strebenden, duldenden Menschen. Mike Savages Analysen zur sozialen Ungleichheit dienen dazu, den sozialen Wandel zu verstehen, liefern aber sozusagen auf dem Weg wichtige und einzigartige Beiträge zu den Diskussionen, die sowohl inner- als auch außerwissenschaftlich über die Ungleichheit in Großbritannien geführt werden. Unermüdlich und über Jahrzehnte verbessert er die Klassenanalyse, indem er Fragen des Lebensstils, des Geschlechts, der nationalen und ethnischen Zugehörigkeit einbezieht. Er erweitert die englische Ungleichheitssoziologie durch sein Interesse für Mittelschichten, für technische Identitäten und Expertise und für die Rolle von Superreichen. Er wendet sich gegen ahistorische Herangehensweisen und weist mit Bourdieu auf die Rolle der kulturellen Selbstinterpretation von Akteuren hin. Im Kontext der internationalen Bourdieu-Rezeption sind seine Studien bahnbrechend, weil sie wie wenige bereit sind, den ganzen Analyserahmen auch empirisch in Frage zu stellen und wirklich auf signifikante nationale Unterschiede hinzuweisen. Savage betont, es gebe in Großbritannien im Gegensatz zum Frankreich Bourdieus innerhalb der Oberschicht keine entscheidende Spaltung zwischen ökonomischem und kulturellem Kapital. Der Modernismus und das intellektuell Spielerische wurden von der Oberschicht früh aufgenommen. Die kulturell wichtigste Spaltung bleibt die ökonomische. Weil ich hier übertreiben darf, wie er es vielleicht nie tun würde, möchte ich überspitzt sagen, dass er herausfindet, dass es in Großbritannien kein kulturelles Kapital gibt. Und das ist unter Soziologen mittlerweile so provokativ im besten Sinne, wie wenn Ronke Oyewumi sagt, es gebe in der Kultur der Yoruba keine Differenzierung der sozialen Geschlechterrollen, also kein Gender. Wenn ich auch zu Fragen sprechen darf, die Savage nicht direkt diskutiert, weil sie in der britischen Soziologie im Allgemeinen nicht diskutiert werden, füge ich hinzu, dass Savages Beobachtungen hier Beweise für die Hypothese liefern, dass funktionale Differenzierung, wie sie von Weber und Luhmann für Deutschland und von Bourdieu für Frankreich beschrieben wurden, in Großbritannien einfach weniger stattgefunden hat. Dass also politische und kulturelle Institutionen viel weniger Autonomie haben und viel direkter von Klassengegensätzen geprägt werden. In den frühen Nullerjahren war Savage einer der ersten, der die damals mit Baumann, Beck, Giddens und Jameson verbundenen Zeitdiagnosen kritisch zu fassen bekommt. Savage nimmt die verschiedenen Behauptungen über einen Epochenwechsel, die immer implizieren, dass ein Theoriewechsel ja oft eigentlich eine Bekehrung nötig sei, in ihren historischen Ansprüchen ernst, untersucht sie auf ihre geschichtsphilosophischen Annahmen und die empirische Beweislage hin und legt ihre Schwächen dar. Diese Strategie scheint im Nachhinein fast offensichtlich, ist aber immer noch nicht ganz selbstverständlich. Auch andere haben früh Kritik geäußert. Zum Beispiel hat mehr oder weniger zeitgleich van Rosrecki in Deutschland an einer Dissertation gearbeitet, die dann als Buch mit dem Titel Die Diagnosegesellschaft erschienen ist. Aber Savage übt die Kritik auf seine Weise. Savage scheut sich nicht, deutliche Worte zu finden. Er kann auch polemisch sein, aber die Wissenssoziologie ist für ihn kein Selbstzweck. Es geht ihm auch nicht um die Provinzialisierung von Epochenunterschieden, die dann als Variation in ein letztlich formalistisches und ahistorisches Schema eingegliedert werden soll. Ich meine, Savage regen die Zeitdiagnosen auf, weil er eigentlich ihr Erkenntnisinteresse teilt. Er will Wandel jenseits der soziologischen Großtheorien im Detail verstehen. Man könnte sein Werk auch überschreiben mit Zeitdiagnose, jetzt mit Daten. In seinen Arbeiten der letzten 2 Jahrzehnte verbindet Savage die Analyse von Ungleichheiten im Wandel meisterhaft, nicht nur mit der Analyse der Wahrnehmung von Ungleichheit, sondern auch mit der Analyse der akademischen Wissensproduktion über Ungleichheit. Die beiden Bücher Identities and Social Change 2010 und The Return of Inequalities 2021, gelesen mit einigen Aufsätzen aus dieser Zeit, zeigen einen Virtuosen, der ein ganz erstaunliches Repertoire beherrscht und kreativ einsetzt. Savage ist jetzt gleichzeitig ein sehr guter quantitativer Forscher zu Ungleichheiten, ein Wissenschaftssoziologe, ein Methodologe, ein Mitreisender der britischen Cultural Studies, ein Kulturhistoriker im Sinne der Kulturgeschichte des 19. Jahrhunderts, der jetzt nun doch auch noch, im Gegensatz zu was ich vorher gesagt habe, ein politischer Historiker und ein Historiker der Weltgeschichte ist. Wie Bourdieu und auch E.P. Thompson betont er, dass die Selbstidentifikation ein unabtrennbarer Teil des Phänomens Klassenformation ist. Und zwar Selbstidentifikation nicht abgelesen von den Antworten auf vorstrukturierte Fragebögen, sondern Selbstidentifikation, wie sie in den Formen der sich natürlich vollziehenden kulturellen Abgrenzung zum Ausdruck kommt. Beweise für diese Abgrenzungsprozesse holt Savage als Historiker nicht nur aus der Sozialforschung, sondern auch aus den Archiven der Sozialforschung. Diese Art der Verbindung von der Analyse von Ungleichheit und Wahrnehmung von Ungleichheit ist an sich also nicht so etwas Neues. Obwohl gerade Savages Beobachtung erstaunlichen Widerstand von Fachkollegen in Großbritannien hervorrufen, die es am wichtigsten zu finden scheinen, immer wieder objektiv zu zeigen, dass sich nichts ändert an objektiven Ungleichheiten. Die andere Art der Verbindung von der Analyse von Ungleichheit und Wahrnehmung von Ungleichheit, die Einbeziehung des gesellschaftlichen Wissensproduktion über die Ungleichheit ins Objekt der Analyse, kennt man sonst höchstens in Ansätzen aus konservativer und libertärer Polemik oder systemtheoretischen Provokationen. Savage geht aber weit über die Polemik hinaus. Er analysiert die Wissensformen in bewundernswertem Detail und verliert die Ungleichheit selbst als Problem nie aus den Augen. In Identities and Social Change analysiert er den Aufstieg des sozialwissenschaftlichen Apparats in den 1940er bis in die 1970er Jahre im historischen Kontext und in seinen Folgen. Er zeigt mit tiefer Kenntnis auch der Literaturgeschichte und der Sozialgeschichte der Literatur, wie die Sozialwissenschaft in dieser Periode die Literatur und die Geschichte in der Vorstellung der englischen Nation, dessen, was als Teil der englischen Nation gewöhnlich und normal ist, ersetzen. In dieser Akzentverschiebung von Literatur zu Sozialwissenschaft verschwindet die Landschaft aus der Vorstellung des Sozialen und ein Begriff von Wandel wird erfunden, der getrennt von Ort und Gemeinschaft untersucht werden kann. Savages Interesse in der Geschichte der Soziologie inkludiert auch die Forschenden und ihre Selbstidentifikation. Mit dem Apparat der Sozialwissenschaften entsteht eine Gruppe von Berufstätigen, die sich auf technische Fertigkeiten beziehen, Fertigkeiten, die ursprünglich von der Arbeiterklasse für sich beansprucht wurden. Diese neuen Mittelklassen verschleiern durch diese Identifikation den Klassencharakter ihrer Abgrenzung und lassen der Arbeiterklasse wenig übrig zur positiven Selbstidentifikation. Und die Arbeiterklasse wird in Folge vor allem über die Defizite, die ihr zugeschrieben werden, definiert. Das Buch Identities and Social Change konzentriert sich auf die 40er bis 70er Jahre. In seinem jüngsten Buch The Return of Inequality spricht Savage zum langen 20. Jahrhundert und zur Gegenwart mit derselben Kombination von Fähigkeiten. Er analysiert den Forschungsstand über sich veränderte Ungleichheit, reflektiert aber auch gleichzeitig über die Wirkungsmacht von verschiedenen Arten der grafischen Darstellung. Er schreibt zum Beispiel über die verschiedenen Formen von Bilder, die sich im Werk von Piketty finden. Er analysiert die Gegenwart vor dem Hintergrund des gesellschaftlichen Rahmens der vorhergehenden Periode, der 70er und 80er Jahre in Großbritannien und anderswo, der zugleich der Rahmen des Selbstverständnisses von breiten Bevölkerungsgruppen, der Rahmen der politischen Antwort auf das Problem der Ungleichheit unter Bedingungen der nationalen Demokratie und der Rahmen der soziologischen Analyse derselben ist. Gruppenunterschiede wurden in dieser Formation der reifen Nachkriegsgesellschaft nicht wie vorher als ein an sich durch ontologische Verschiedenheiten gerechtfertigt, sondern als probabilistische zwischen formal Gleichen verstanden. Die Meritokratie dient sowohl als lebensweltlich-moralischer, als politischer und als methodischer Maßstab. Diese Art der Bearbeitung der Ungleichheit kommt in der Gegenwart an seine Grenzen. Die neue Betonung von Fragen des Respekts, der Wertigkeit, der Repräsentation und Anerkennung ist für Savage nicht wirklich neu. Er will sie nicht als neue Identitätspolitik der alten Verteilungspolitik gegenüberstellen, sondern sieht sie auch als eine Rückkehr zur Geschichte, die mit der Rückkehr von manchen extremen Formen von Ungleichheiten einhergeht. Savage prägt über die Ungleichheitsforschung hinaus die Diskussion über das soziale Leben der Methoden. Einen Begriff, den er wohl mit erfunden hat und der vieles ermöglicht hat, auch und gerade für die bessere Anwendung dieser Methoden. Er wurde so zum allseits respektierten Wegbegleiter der Science and Technology Studies, ohne sich ihnen je ganz anzuschließen. Wenn ich in meinem letzten Punkt noch einmal übertreiben darf, würde ich sagen, zum sozialen Leben der Methoden gehört auch der soziale Tod. Ein gemeinsam mit Roger Burroughs verfasster Aufsatz zur kommenden Krise der empirischen Soziologie erregte 2007 Aufsehen mit der These, dass die Zeit der großen Survey-Daten und der mit ihnen verbundenen linear-kausalen Methoden in der Sozialforschung vorbei sei. Diese seien einerseits relationalen Ansätzen theoretisch unterlegen und waren in dem Sinn immer schon veraltet. Sie sind andererseits von der Wirklichkeit neu bedroht. Keiner will sich mehr Zeit nehmen, diese Surveys zu beantworten. Die Samples werden immer schlechter. Gleichzeitig gibt es immer mehr Daten, die als Nebenprodukt von natürlich digital sich vollziehendem sozialen Leben entstehen. Es geht Savage hier nicht nur darum, alte Widersacher in der abstrakten, ahistorischen Ungleichheitssoziologie und Mobilitätsforschung neu zu überholen, höchstens vielleicht ein bisschen. Anders als andere nimmt er die epistemischen Konsequenzen der neuen Daten ernst, ohne sie nur abzulehnen. Savage bringt in seinen Interventionen Unterschiede gerade unter quantitativen Methoden hervor, die zu wenig Beachtung finden, und gibt mit einem Plädoyer für den Wert des Beschreibens neue Impulse. Wie also verändert sich die Welt? Wie verändert sie sich für und durch die Menschen, die in ihr und in ihr im Verhältnis zu anderen Menschen ihre Lebensentwürfe entwickeln und durchzusetzen suchen? Welche Beobachtungen produzieren die verschiedenen Methoden der Sozialwissenschaften? Wie prägen die sich verändernden Sozialwissenschaften die sich verändernde Welt? Wir werden heute Abend und wie ich sehr hoffe auch in Zukunft von Mike Savage noch Antworten hören, die es sich lohnen wird zu bedenken und mit unseren eigenen Beobachtungen und denen von anderen zu vergleichen.
The symbolic gesture behind
Thank you.
this award.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I hope I have some slides here. Yep. It's on the screen. So thank you. It's a wonderful privilege to be here. Get it. Thank you, Senator Broster. Thank you, Monica, Professor Monica Kraus. Thank you, Professor Noble. It's wonderful to be here and win this award and share my thoughts with you tonight. I feel very humble, because I see myself often as a very empirical researcher. And it's, I do particular projects for particular purposes, and to hear my work summarized, is quite challenging and scary. But it does do justice, I think, to what I try to do in this book, The Return of Inequality, which was published 2 years ago. And as I will discuss, what I try and do in this book is think about how does a sociologist think about inequality, and how does a sociologist think about inequality in a way which rises to the challenge of economists, because economists have become so powerful in shaping our discourse, political discourse, intellectual discourse, and intellectual discourse, and social scientific discourse. And I think sociologists, we need to be in that debate. We need to be shaping the discussion of inequality. And I thought, well, you know, someone has to try and do it. So although I didn't, in very British modesty, think I was the best person, I would try, and that was the attempt of my book. So what I would do today is share some of the ideas in my book, but I want to reflect upon a particular puzzle, which I'm going to come back to again and again, which is, and the puzzle is this: we live in a world, as the Senator was saying, a world of massive inequality, which has got much worse in recent decades across most of the world. And yet, politically, we are not seeing the resistance to that inequality, which we might think we should do. So it's a really profound challenge for us all, which is, you know, why are we not seeing more people concerned about the issues which you talked about, you know, the power of the super rich, people flying in private jets around the world, populist politicians who have such power and such influence. And this is an issue of politics, it's also an issue of social science. And what I want to try and do in these 45 minutes is reflect upon that issue as a puzzle and suggest some ways of addressing it using the ideas in my book. So sociologists need to step up. We need to think about the big picture. We need to try and address the challenges of today, but we need to do so informed by historical scholarship, which is, I think, very much in keeping with the view of this institute, and it's very much in keeping with my own intellectual formation. And that's what I will try and do in this book, in my book, trying to match some of the great work of the economists here. So I'll try and talk in four bits of 10 minutes each, hopefully 10 minutes each, try and keep the time. The puzzle is, why has redistributionist politics stalled at the very moment when we are back to inequality levels of 100 years ago? Why isn't there more contestation around trying to get fairer shares of the cake? That's the first puzzle. I'll introduce that to you. Second issue is my debate with the economists. And here I want to try and argue that the way the economists address this issue is not enough. The way the economists approach that question is to say, we've got to understand the distributional nature of that inequality. And we've got to focus upon the trends in incomes and wealth. We've got to recognize the power of the 1% and all that. That's important. It's an important stepping stone, but it's not enough by itself. And I want to talk about what I call the phenomenology of wealth. That is to say, what wealth means to most people is the good life. It is the chance to lead a good human life. And being seen to attack wealth itself is not going to be appealing to many people, because it seems to be about attacking that notion of the good life. And then I'm going to turn to my long-term interests in social class, which of course Monica spoke about and the Senator spoke about. But I also want to try and argue we need to rethink class analysis in the context of extreme inequality. We can't just rely upon old models of class, and in particular we can't rely upon notions of the working classes as the kind of progressive force of history. This was a tradition in which I was schooled, you know, E.P. Thompson. That notion that there's the kind of heroic project of the working class. Very, very romantic, very attractive, but those days have gone. I want to be a bit polemical, but that's what I want to try and argue. It doesn't mean that the politics of class have ended, but it means we need to refashion the way we think about class. That's the final bit of my lecture, which is restoring the radical vision. How do we think about addressing, bringing back a sense of progressive hope. And I want to talk about some work I'm doing with some colleagues at the LSE on the political ontology of corruption. So the issue is, how do we get people to recognise inequality as an issue? I want to try and suggest that there's increasing concern about corruption and unfairness and injustice. Much of that, it can be tied up with high incomes and high wealth. It's not, but it has been up till now much more effectively mobilised by populist politicians. But there is an opportunity to try and seize that argument from a different perspective. Okay, so the puzzle, being with the puzzle. So this is the famous graph, if any of you read Piketty's book on capital in the 21st century, you've seen lots of these kinds of graphs, and this is one looking at the share of income taken by the top 10% of earners in the US, Europe and Japan. And indeed, he's done this with many parts of the world. And the story is one which is very familiar now, which is very simply, we know we used to live in the bad old times of high inequality up till the 1920s. Then there was this period in the middle part of the 20th century when inequality levels were reduced quite substantially. And that's fairly common across much of the rich world. But we are now back at the the bad old days of high inequality. Right? And this is Piketty's argument in this book, Capital and Ideology. And what he says in this recent book, which came out 3 years ago, is, well, therefore we need to return to what he calls participatory socialism. We need to kind of restore the socialist vision. Because we are now back in the period in time where the socialist movements and the communist movements became powerful in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. But the problem is that is not happening. But, you know, we can look to a few examples. Obviously, in Germany, you have a social democratic government. The Labour Party is doing quite well in the opinion polls in Britain now. Nonetheless, the trends have been very different. This is a graph produced a few years ago by the Economist newspaper, which charts the changing fortunes of the social democratic vote across Europe. In 1970, it's indexed at 100. And you can see that in the 1980s and 1990s, actually the left did pretty well. In fact, in that period of neoliberalism as a kind of response, perhaps, to that neoliberal turn. But in the period since 2000, that the left vote has stalled. And indeed, some other research by my former LSE colleague Simon Hicks, which charts this trend through to more recent times, shows that that decline is continuing. So it is counterintuitive that the left vote has declined at the period when you might think the appeal of redistribution is more powerful because there has been such an increase in inequality. And that's the puzzle. Why aren't we seeing the left more electorally effective in many, many parts of the world? And this is another point. It goes back to the theme which Monica was raising about. I mean, I'm always interested in tracing through how objective structures link into beliefs and values. And we have this other, puzzle, which is that people believe in meritocracy. Okay? So this graph shows how many British people believe that social success is determined by hard work. Okay? And as you can see, this traces back to the 1930s. People have always believed that in very high numbers, which might be a bit surprising. But if you look at that thick line for the working class, that did actually decline in the 1980s, but is now back up to nearly 90% of working class Britons think that success is determined by hard work, which is kind of, it goes against all the kind of social science, shows the power of sexism and racism and classism in affecting things, but that is the view. And it's happened, that rise has happened at the very same time that inequality has increased. So what is going on? And one thing I want to share with you is also the kind of issue about, there are protests. One argument is to say the action is now moved outside the electoral political sphere towards social movements, towards civil society. Now, that's definitely an argument which I'm very interested in, and I think it has a lot of mileage. And here are some 4 examples of this, which have been very effective. Occupy Wall Street really became headline news in the years after the 2008 financial crash in pinpointing the significance of the super rich. Then we had movements like Oxfam, the very famous anti-poverty campaigner, pivoting and saying, we're now much more concerned about inequality. Let's target the wealthy. Let's not just think about the poor, let's target the wealthy. And of course you have Black Lives Matter and Me Too more recently. So there is this powerful sense of resentment, of protest, but has that crystallized into a wider political movement? That's the question I'm putting out there, but I'm not sure it has. If you take the Gramscian argument about you need to win hegemony, it's not enough just to protest. You need to actually win the political high ground and persuade wide numbers of people that the leadership needs to come from these views. And I would see, particularly the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too, very effective in raising visibility, but have they actually been able to tackle the big underlying inequalities? I'm not so sure about that. So here we have, this is the puzzle. High levels of inequality, and yet politically, I would say we have not seen the kind of protests we have seen historically. So why not? So here I'm going to discuss my reflections on some of the economists. And as Monica says, I've been very influenced by the cultural turn. Much of my work at Manchester was really debating about culture, not about economics very much. Then I moved to the LSE, which there's many economists. So you have to kind of think about the role of economics. And it's been very informative for me, and I very much welcome the Piketty style of argument because it was long-term analysis. And he was placing trends over many years, and he was also opening up the debate to wider social sciences. So I want to kind of rehearse the value of that approach, but also point to what I think that group of economists does not quite grasp about why just pointing to distributions is not going to, I don't think, win over a mass movement against inequality. So here's the kind of graph which you get if you look at the work of the Paris School of Economics. They have a very powerful website, the World Inequality Database, which you can very easily click on, and you can find trends. Most countries of the world now, you can find trends, and this is a typical measure they use, which is what proportion of national income is taken by the top 10%. And then you can look at it over various moments in time. So I just took this one recently. And what you find is some variability. The South African case is really amazing, remarkable. It is now the most unequal country in the world. Its inequality has doubled since apartheid was ended. Sort of fascinating, isn't it? You get rid of apartheid, thankfully, and yet you have the escalation of economic inequality in that country. And then in the red, you get the very well-known US case. US very dysfunctional. You've seen a huge rise of the top 1% in the United States. But in China, massively in the yellow, massively growing economy, and that growth has also helped to generate high levels of inequality in that country, from a country which has been historically, of course, quite relatively egalitarian because it was a communist society. It is true, most European nations are less unequal, but in fact they've also been increasing too. Germany has been a steady rise of the top 10% of earners. UK saw a big rise in the 80s. And which has persisted since then. And France is the slight exception because that's the blue at the bottom, which has stayed relatively stable. But generally, it's a story of increasing distributional inequalities to a greater or lesser extent. And Piketty also introduces a second theme, which is really fundamental to my arguments in the book and what I want to say today. And he has this phrase, capital is back. And with this phrase, he's referring to the Marxist tradition. He's not a Marxist exactly, but what he is pointing to is the accumulation of capital of all kinds, of private wealth, as a driver of economic and social change. And here, this is a kind of paradox. So we have seen this big build-up of private wealth, and he measures it in terms of these capital income ratios, and what that means is he's charting for these different parts of the world, Germany, France, UK, what's the total stock of capital as a ratio of the size of the national income. And in all those countries in the last 50 years or so, you've seen a big rise in the accumulation of capital. What does this mean? It means many things. This is the kind of underpinning argument of my book. It means many things, but one of the things it means is the weight of the past. Because if you have an accumulation of capital, capital is invested, accumulated over many years, generations. And it means that the power and the interests of old oligarchs, elites, become more powerful again. It really cuts against the common sense view that we're living in these dynamic, accelerationist times of modern society. What we actually are seeing with the return of wealth is, in fact, the renewal, the return of oligarchs, if you like, of elites, of the wealthy. In some ways, rather similar to the old aristocrats of the 19th century. And I'm going to draw out this distinction. It's very important for my argument. So what are we referring to in the difference between income and wealth? So income can be measured in terms of your wages, your salary, benefits you might get from the state. You might extend it to include a social wage or in-kind resources, but fairly concrete. It's the amount of money you receive. You get paid on an hourly, a weekly, and monthly basis. And it has been what most economists have focused on when they look at inequality. But then what Piketty is saying is behind that, you've also got to look at wealth inequality. And these are people's assets, private assets, which can be given a monetary value and possibly sold. And this is the kind of the hidden bit of the I always call it the hidden bit of the iceberg. If you can imagine an iceberg, the bit you can see is the income inequality, but beneath that, visible tip of the iceberg is this heavy weight of what you can't see underneath the surface of the ocean. And it's this which is driving the current revival of inequality. And one way of understanding the significance of this is in this argument about we're seeing a rising share of income which is now derived from capital. That is to say, here I'm just doing very simple economics. But if you look at the amount of national income earned in any country, some of that national income comes from people's earnings, what they earn for their jobs. Other bits of that income can come from various kinds of capital, rent, investments from stocks and shares, interest from savings. And the important point that this graph illustrates is that over the last 30 years, the amount of income being drawn from capital, or what you might call unproductive work, is growing. Here again is a great, I think this really gives the lie to this view that we're somehow living in this very dynamic, meritorious society, because in fact, people are increasingly drawing upon their assets, and they're becoming increasingly significant part of social income, if you like. Now, so that's bad, all right? But what's also really bad is that wealth inequality is invariably more unequal than income inequality. So this is a graph produced by Fabian Pfeffer and Laura Weitkus, looking at the concentration of wealth and income across these different countries. The orange is the amount of wealth owned by the top 5% of wealth holders, and the blue is the amount of income taken by the top 5% of income owners. And as you can see, the share of wealth is nearly always double the amount of wealth concentration is double the amount of income concentration. So if we pivot towards wealth, we see things even more scarily, if you like. We see even more concentration of economic power than if we look at income. And that's really also true too if you look at the fortunes of the super rich. This is a graph which Piketty produced for the French case. And basically, the poor people in France are on the left-hand side of this. And as you go towards the right-hand side of this graph, you get to the top 5%, the top 1%, and the top 0.1%. And the point is, the super rich, you know, are the ones who predominantly get their income from the green, from capital. So then, you know, this discourse we have about them being these dynamic people who are just making amazing things happen is at the best very partial, because it misses the way in which actually they benefit from these capital investments. I mean, the famous anecdote I always recite, which I think came from Piketty's book, and it may be apocryphal, but it's the fact that Bill Gates has earned more money since he stopped being chief executive of Microsoft. You know, that he's actually earned far more in investment returns, you know, after he stopped working, which is a fascinating example of how these dynamics reinforce each other. Okay, so but here my argument with the economists begins. So I'm very impressed with it, and really important arguments from the economists. But the way the economists generally pursue this point is to say, oh, these distributional unfairnesses are really, really even more unfair when we look at wealth. Therefore, we've really got to alert the population to this unfairness even more. And there's a big emphasis upon just getting the word out there that this is unfair, this is bad. Now, I'm very sympathetic to that argument, but I'm not sure it's enough to really get people to feel angry about wealth inequality. And I wrote an article with a couple of colleagues, a couple of LSE colleagues about this. Why isn't there more support for progressive taxation of wealth, a sociological contribution to the wider debate? I just want to draw upon some of the arguments we made. But the argument is this. Income is very concrete. Right? You know, people roughly know how much they earn. You know how much money is coming to your bank account. You can make assumptions around it. Wealth, by contrast, is very opaque. People don't know how wealthy they are on many occasions. It's a stock. It's a resource you might be able to draw upon, but it can be very difficult to get a handle around it. Also difficult to know, how do you know if you're wealthy? When it comes to income, if you work for a large organisation, you will know where you stand normally. There'll be income distribution. You'll have a sense about, am I well paid in my organisation? Am I badly paid? Is that fair, unfair? Am I being treated badly? Why did so-and-so get a pay increase, not me? Those sort of issues. That's almost endemic, any kind of organisation. Harder to do that with wealth, because who are you comparing yourself with? Supposing the wealth you acquire comes from having an expensive house in London, or you've made very good returns on your stocks and shares. The people you're comparing that with are not obviously comparable. You don't actually know who they are. So in fact, it's actually rather more difficult, I think, to generate a sense of distributional unfairness when you look at wealth compared to income. Similarly, income levels, as we see, of course, profoundly through the trade union movement, are very, they are bound up with a sense of morality, the morality of our organisation. Is it fair that we're paid this much? So in the UK, I'm not sure what it's like in Germany, in the UK there's a big discussion about why is the chief executive of this company paid so much and the average worker is paid much less. And we're having, actually currently in our universities, we're having an industrial dispute, and it's quite common for the vice-chancellor, the director of all the universities, to have their salaries put on the Twitter and saying, well, why is it, how do you justify getting paid such a lot of money when the average salary is much, much less? So income lends itself to being politicised, but wealth arguably doesn't, because often wealth inequality can be attributed to luck. You made the right investment. You bought a house in the right place at the right time, and you benefited from it. It's not, and I recognise I'm lucky, lucky me, or unlucky me, but it's not necessarily seen as a political issue. And hence, it doesn't necessarily generate the structural divisions. Fourthly, and I think really importantly, is particularly when we're living in a society where public welfare provision is being stripped back, when people cannot rely so much upon public healthcare, public housing, public support, private wealth becomes a vital sense of personal security. So people's thinking about their future and their prospects and their retirement is bound up with how much personal wealth do I have as a cushion for myself. And therefore, if you seem to be sort of anti-wealth, that can imply that you're anti the good life, you're anti-security. You want to make things insecure for people. And that can be a barrier to generating politicized views about wealth inequality. Now, in some cases, in time, historically, and these are the times when Piketty is talking about, there are times when wealth inequality has generated hostility and a sense of progressive politics. That happens historically when wealth, the accumulation of wealth is seen to be bound up with a particular group category. Here are 3 examples. Slavery, when slave owners acquired wealth by virtue of owning slaves. That is very clearly an association between wealth accumulation and racialized exclusion. Patriarchal forces. You know, until the 20th century, women could not own wealth in most societies. Wealth was owned by fathers and husbands. And that was one of the strong reasons for feminism in the first part of the 20th century to address that. Similarly, in many societies, certainly in Britain, huge resentment about the wealth of landed elites, with the aristocratic estates and all the kind of conspicuous consumption which went along with that. So historically, wealth inequality has generated conflict, but generally, when you find this overlap with these categorical divides, now contemporary wealth inequality, I would argue, has largely lost those direct associations with categorical inequalities. And it's become naturalized. And there's some recent sociology exactly arguing that these days wealthy elites try and act modestly. They don't, yes, okay, to be sure, we're aware of rich Russians with super yachts, but actually the reality is many wealthy people play down their wealth. And in the words of Rachel Sherman, who did this interesting study of wealthy Manhattanites in New York, they really try to come over as modest, we don't really spend much, we don't really have much money. They try and hide their wealth. And Elizabeth Schumfossel had this really interesting book on rich Russians, which argues that even the Russian oligarchs have moved to a culture of modesty and not displaying their wealth in the same way as they did in the immediate post-Soviet period. So when that happens, when there's not a culture of conspicuous consumption, then wealth sort of goes underground and it becomes more difficult to criticize. And in these situations, social mobility discourse is also very important, because the argument is it is possible for black people, for women to become super wealthy. And it's certainly in Britain, this is a very politicized discourse about it is possible for anyone to become super rich. And of course we see our current Prime Minister absolutely playing to that sort of argument. And it helps legitimize society. So my argument really is, sadly, I don't think just pointing to extreme distributional inequalities around wealth is enough. Because for many people, wealth is seen to be a good thing which is bound up with personal security. And it's not bad. Now, I want to share a few insights from discussion about the wealth tax in the UK in 2020, which was led by my colleagues at the LSE, Aaron Advani and Andy Summers, and a lawyer called Emma Chamberlain. I'm very pleased that the work this is partly funded by the Atlantic Fellows Programme, which I helped to lead for a while. And I just want to share with you some of the discussion around, should we have a wealth tax in the UK? We currently do not have a wealth tax in the UK. But there has been discussion about it. Should we be bringing in a wealth tax? And this wealth tax commission discussed the evidence and made the argument that if there was a one-off emergency wealth tax of 1% on all assets over £500,000 threshold, that would generate £260 billion. And that sum of money I wouldn't say it's enough to fix the British state, but it would go a long way. It would, we are currently in a massive crisis and discussions about how you raise a few billion pounds. This measure would really do it. And it wouldn't really, it's not a revolutionary argument, is it? 1%, asking rich people to pay 1% of their wealth is hardly saying you're going to be expropriated on the kind of Bolshevik model. And, so that's, in terms of economic logic, it seems surely, a winner. Who on earth can resist that argument? The team also argue about the value that the public can see that the idea of a wealth tax could be popular. And they carried out some opinion polls, some surveys to back up this argument. I want to show you a bit of the evidence for it. And they do use these kind of leading questions. You're not supposed to use leading questions in social science, but they kind of said, well, if we have to raise taxes, what's the least bad way to do it? Which is not exactly saying, do you want to raise taxes? But it's like saying, if the government has to raise taxes, how do you want to do it? And they have these various options. Introduce a new wealth tax, introduce council tax, that's the tax we have on our property tax. Increase capital gains tax, that's a tax on income from wealth. So if you get money from rent or from selling houses, not from rent, but selling houses or selling stocks and shares, you have to pay a capital gains tax. Increase income tax or VAT, which is our sales tax. And it is interesting that the black is the number of people who would do that as the first, second or third preference. As you can see, that is the least unpopular tax. That is interesting. That suggests an income tax and sales tax, no one really wants to raise those. And so there is a very interesting contrast, I think, between those two things. But the issues, and of course, I very much would support wealth taxes too, but the problems begin when you think about, well, what level do you set this wealth tax at? And this is the kind of, people are asked, what's your threshold? And the point is here that actually there's no consensus about what the threshold would be. It goes from £250,000 up to £1 billion or more. And that's part of the discussion about the fact it's very difficult to know at what level do you say too much wealth is too much. People have very different perceptions in that. So it would be really hard, I think, to establish a consensus about what constitutes riches. But the point I want to make, I better move on, and the point I want to make is this one here, which I think is, to me, this is the most interesting finding. It's about what wealth assets should be taxed. Okay. And the green is the kind of the ones people do not want to be taxed in the UK. And the interesting thing here is, as you can see, very few people want to tax wealth from savings. Why not? Because savings are what we use as a kind of safety net, a cushion if we lose our job or if we get ill. Yeah? No one wants that savings cushion to be taxed. No one wants their pension to be taxed. Now, actually, pension in wealth is a huge driver of inequality, and wealthy people get huge breaks of taxes on pensions in Britain. So economically, there'd be a very good reason for taxing pensions, but very few people want to do that. Very few people want to tax wealth accumulation on your main family home. But interestingly, and to me, I'm going to come back to this later, where people do want to see more taxation is around investment income and income from wealth on other properties, second homes, homes you rent out. So here what's going on, I think, is people are distinguishing between wealth tied up in my own family personal life versus wealth which is seen to be kind of instrumental, strategic, and based upon business calculations. And that's, for me, that's very important to understand this. That just pushing on a distributional unfairness isn't going to be enough, because you've got to recognise that some forms of wealth are seen to be part of the good life, but there is also a recognition that some wealth can be acquired unfairly, strategically, or illegitimately. Right, I'm going to rush because I don't want to take too long, it's very hot. So that's my argument with economists, right? So let's move on to the sociological argument about class. And this is me rehearsing, my own thinking over many decades, actually. And going back to this, Monica mentioned this book, The Making of the English Working Class. And for me, this has always been a kind of key argument which historians and sociologists have brought to the table, which is that we got to understand how subaltern groups, the working class, the peasants, the dominated groups can be forces for progressive social change. And that has led to an extensive sociology trying to decide who are the working class, where are the boundaries between the working class and the middle class, why are some working class people not very left-wing, why are others more left-wing. This has been a huge debate. And my first book, which was my PhD, was absolutely all about this. Why this particular town I studied, Preston in Lancashire, was not very radical. Why not? So perhaps we need to go back to this tradition. Think about, okay, let's try and revive a working class awareness, working class consciousness, and try and get them to recognise the unfairness of contemporary inequality. Now, again, I'm sympathetic to that idea objectively, structurally, but we do have to recognise that the demographic shifts in society have made the industrial working class really difficult to hold them out as a kind of a driver of progressive social change. The historian Eric Hobsbawm, I remember I was a young man at the time, he wrote this article, I think in 1978, called The Forward March of Labour Halted. It was very controversial in England, because what he was saying is that, and he was very, very astute, very prescient. He identified an argument for saying that the view that the working class would become more and more powerful was fading away. Now, since he wrote that, all sorts of reasons have come to light about the declining and fading significance of the working class, mostly bound up with the decline of industry, but also recognising what's happening at the top end of society and the pulling away of elites and the rising power of wealth assets, which are changing the contours of class divisions. Together with the real problem that old model of class was premised upon the notion of basically male working class and male white working class. And that is a real issue when we have a much more diverse labour market than perhaps was historically the case. I wanted to talk through in a few slides what's happened in the British case. Because the British case has been really profound in the last 10 years, because what we have seen for the first time ever at the last election, the working class, as it's understood sociologically, voted for the Conservative Party rather than the Labour Party. And that's historically always been assumed that the working class would, to a greater or lesser extent, vote for the Labour Party. Now, the heyday of that was in the 1950s and 60s, but it persisted into the 80s and 90s. But this chart, produced by the political sociologists Evans and Mellon, traced it through to the last three elections, 2015, 2017, and 2019. And if you look particularly at and anything above the dotted line is more likely to vote Conservative than Labour. And what we saw in the last election is the working class big shift to the Conservative Party. They are more likely now to vote Conservatives than the middle classes. Quite a profound shift in voting patterns, one which is massively borne out by other literature on voting trends across many parts of the world. Thomas Piketty has coined this phrase, the Brahmin left, to talk about the fact that social democratic movements are increasingly supported by well-educated middle-class people, not the historic industrial working class. Here's another example of that trend, produced by, some more political scientists. Every dot in these graphs is a particular constituency, particular local area, and on the x-axis in the bottom, you can see the proportion proportion of people in those constituencies who are working class. Or on the right-hand side is more working class, and the proportion above the dotted line, above the 0% are Labour. Basically, as we move on with the elections, you find the line straightening, and you find basically the constituencies with more working class voters are more likely to vote Conservative. This is a really profound historical shift. What is going on? Well, of course, what is going on is exactly what I was talking about before, the rise of wealth assets. and the way in which wealth assets are decomposing the collar line and their occupational divisions. Really interesting work produced by Lisa Adkins and colleagues at Sydney University, who argue that, and they're particularly focusing on the Australian case, but the same argument can be made in the UK, that really now people, certainly in the wealthy cities, generate more income from their housing assets than they do from employment, if they're lucky enough to own wealthy homes. And as you're seeing assets, the value of assets rise, so that weakens the power of occupational divisions, of labour market divisions, it weakens the power of trade unions, and it creates a focus upon these wealth assets, which I showed earlier on are not generating a radical progressive distribution. And the issue here is, and I've discussed this over several articles, sure, we know there's a wealthy elite, and we can get very fixated upon the top 1%, but there's also a group which Piketty calls the patrimonial middle classes, who are around 20% of people in rich societies like Germany, like UK. These are not super rich, but they are people who are comfortably off, and they have significant wealth resources, enough for their children to expect to be able to inherit at some point in the future. Piketty reckons that 16% of French people can expect to earn 750,000 euros at some point in their life. That's a lot of money to inherit. And it's not just the 1%, it's bigger than that. So a significant number of middle classes are now, tied up with the asset regime. And the work we did in the UK with the Great British Class Survey suggested that's about 7% are really part of a very wealthy elite class. So this is really, so the fact that capital is back is also weakening class divides. And I don't think just calling for class politics is going to really address this big shift. So last part of my talk, and the most provocative, most unformed in a way, is to think about, well, how do we address this issue? How do we think about, as the Senator was saying, we have to tackle these problems of sustainability, the environment. We can't go on as we are for the next 10, 15, 20 years without the world burning up. So we've got to tackle them. How do we do it? I don't think we can do it with a simplistic, let's just try and tilt things back in a more progressive direction. We have to recognise, and this is the argument of my book, that we are seeing the revival of these very old-fashioned, very traditional forms of social life, the return of inheritance, the return of the extended family, the revival of imperial forms of governance, city-states, elite power. So we have to recognise the forces of history are not in our favour, but what we can also do is think about historical parallels from the past, which might give us some ideas for challenging contemporary inequalities. And this is where I want to just reflect on the radical vision. This is the last chapter of my book, in which I argue really that what we can do is recognise, if we go back to the 19th century when there were huge inequalities of income and wealth, and that did generate massive public protests, revolutions in fact. What caused that? What generated that? Well, a lot of it was generated by a sense of unfairness, injustice, and also arguments about the growing power of corruption. This is just the recap of my earlier slide, but the last point is the one I've highlighted here. That when wealth is seen to be acquired unfairly or corruptly, that is when the public will rally and say, we need to tackle this. And we've seen, of course, a very interesting case of this in the UK in the last year with Boris Johnson, formerly very successful, being discredited because he seemed to be corrupt and parting away when other Britons were at home. So it's a very powerful discourse, this corruption discourse. And if you are seen to be unfair, if you seem to be not playing by the rules, that can be a really powerful lever. The point here is that argument about corruption and injustice is often seen to be a liberal argument. It's not necessarily seen to be a kind of redistributionist argument, but there is a potential, I would argue, for linking them together, for trying to make a link between the unfairness, corruption argument, and the redistributionist argument. And that's where we need to be doing more work. Okay, 5 minutes just on these a few themes. This is from recent research. I'm not going to talk about these in any detail, just give you a bit of flavour of some of the issues coming up in research on the UK, which suggests that this thing about corruption has a lot of play amongst disadvantaged British communities. The point about the corruption discourse is that discourse is mobilised by the populist right. Because when it came to Brexit, it was the EU who seemed to be corrupt. And it was the Labour, it was kind of the cultural elite who seemed to be corrupt in looking after each other and giving each other jobs. So actually the political right have been very effective in seizing that corruption discourse. And the left have been not as effective. But there is a potential to recognise that that the rise of wealth inequality, wealth itself isn't necessarily seen as a problem, but when wealth is seen to be unfairly acquired, then things change. Now, a few examples. I'm not going to go into the details. This is a cluster analysis we did of a major British panel survey, National Child Development Survey, and the point is when basically we just try to cluster British people according to their amounts of capital, economic and cultural. And the 3 extreme groups are a group at the bottom we call them the disenfranchised or the precariats, and then 2 kinds of elite groups, the cultural elite and the economic elite. And then we, having done this cluster analysis, we try to look at the attitudes of those groups. So we're looking at these 3 extreme groups. The disenfranchised, these are the most disadvantaged. These are people who are on the lowest paid jobs, living in the worst housing, often don't vote, often are opposed to politics. And then we've got 2 elite groups. But what you can see here is when you ask these groups questions like, none of the political parties would do anything to benefit from me. Yes, that gets a lot of support from the disenfranchised. When you ask, politicians are in politics for self-interest, yeah, that gets a lot of support from disenfranchised. There's not much difference which political party is in power. That's half of the disenfranchised say that. So you can see the amount of cynicism here, which indicates there's a sense of corruption and unfairness in political life. When you ask questions about economic equity, so on the left-hand side, the working people don't get a fair share of nations' wealth. 2/3 of people at the bottom of society say, yes, that's true. When you ask people, there's one law for the rich and another for the poor, again, well over half of the disenfranchised say that. So what the point is here, that yes, these are not translating into votes for the Labour Party anymore, but it doesn't mean that people are happy and thinking, oh, well, we're living in a good society. There's a lot of resentment. And that's the kind of resentment and recognition, if you like, of the unfairness which potentially can be tapped. Now, this is where, just the last few slides. So I'm currently working on a project with some colleagues who should be, just it's the people at the bottom here. We're working on a paper called A Political Ontology of Corruption Discourse. This is a mixed method quant and core project, and my colleagues Mark Frensham and Aaron Reeves have been looking at opinion poll evidence about sentences of corruption in Britain, but also more generally. And also my colleagues, Sasha Hillhorst, who's an LSE PhD student, and Insa Koch, who is an anthropologist, now working at St. Gallen in Switzerland, but has done a lot of work in British working class communities. They've spent a lot of time ethnographically, living in very poor areas in Britain, living on public housing estates. And what they found, and I'm just here to kind of hopefully help them bring things together. I haven't done any much focused work on this, but what Sasha and Insa were very interested in, and they spent many months, years, living in these really deprived areas of the old industrial towns. You have areas like this, of course, in Germany, although German manufacturing is much stronger than Britain. And what they came across was a sense of corruption being endemic in political life. Let me just give a few. Oops, going the wrong way here. Yeah. This is Sasha Hillhorst. Mansfield is a town in the English Midlands. There's always historically been Labour, strong trade union movement. It used to be coal mines, strong coal mining town. Of course, it's now moved to the Conservative Party. The Conservatives now have this local seat. And it's often said that the working class in these areas are left behind, they're just sort of passive, they're apathetic. What comes out of this is actually they're not, because there's a very lot of knowledge here about the local politics. So this particular Labour MP, whose name is Alan Meal, this is some quotes which Sasha came up with. And there's lots of stories about this guy. I could throw up. And they've got she's in a pub, a working men's club. Everyone wanting to contribute. He did nothing about job creation or anything, nothing about anything, never said yes or no. He was a waste of oxygen. At this point, this was a couple of years ago, okay, so this was before Boris Johnson's fall from grace. But at this point in time, he was seen to be, a jolly person. He could play this sort of game of popular politics. He claimed other people were corrupt, and he was much more popular. And also able to play the game of pork barrel politics. He bought he gave £500,000 to the town centre. So it's unfair, it's wrong to characterise this as a group of people who've been left behind or ignorant or passive. A lot of feeling here, but it mobilises around the discourse of corruption. Here's another example about a former steel town, Corby, in English Midlands. Again, historically Labour Party through and through. It's now a Conservative Party. I've always felt that politicians are a very unsafe bunch, etc., etc., etc. We're way down the list, etc. And all these stories about, House of Lords and things pop up. So there's something here which is about wealth inequality. And it's not criticising wealth as such, but it's criticising the association between wealth and corruption. Very similar to the kinds of things E.P. Thompson talked about in the early 19th century, when he makes the argument that the formation of the English working class consciousness, in the British context, was bound up with a critique of old corruption, as it was called, which is the way the landed aristocrats had patronage power over lots of public offices, and such like. So we're back at those times when this power of corruption discourse can be mobilised and has a high degree of presence. Here's in terms of the quant data, this is a graph produced by Aaron Reeves and Mark Fransham, and it's just showing this is a comparative cross-European country analysis, which shows on the y-axis, on the left axis, this is the proportion of people who believe corruption is very widespread. So in a lot of countries, on the top, half of people think corruption is very widespread. Okay? So a lot of people think that. And if you look on the right-hand side, on the x-axis, is the proportion of people who identify as working class. The interesting correlation here is that the more people think of themselves as being working class, the more likely they are to see corruption. There's a kind of association between working class awareness and this corruption discourse. And then you've got the alternative, where there's a lower sense of working class consciousness in the bottom left-hand corner, which includes West Germany. There's also a lesser sense of corruption, which is kind of interesting. And here, just again, gives you these are strong working class. 40% of working class Brits think that corruption is widespread, and 30% think corruption personally affects my life. So this is my sociological and political argument, really, that we are seeing these profound challenges to society, bound up with the rise of wealth inequality. And we have to recognise this is really threatening social sustainability, because wealthy people think they can provide everything they need themselves. They can buy their own houses, they can buy their own education, buy their own healthcare. But in itself, just pointing to extreme wealth inequality isn't necessarily going to create social movements, popular opinion against that. Because as public services get withdrawn, so people look to a certain amount of wealth as their safety net. So wealth inequality tends to be depoliticising. Nonetheless, intensifying what inequality does generate a sense of unfairness, of corruption, of entitlement, and the populist right have been very good and very adept at taking advantage of that. They're the ones who have seized that moment to become very effective in many countries. But I don't think that's necessarily inevitable. And what I suggest is, and this is the last chapter of my book really, is to suggest, well, historically, for decades, we've seen a separation between liberal and socialist movements. And liberals are seen to be about fairness and justice, defined in individualistic ways, whereas socialists are about redistribution. And that's been a historic split. That wasn't so strongly marked, of course, in the 19th century, where there was much more overlap and intersection between those views, and perhaps we have to return to that alliance today and think about how you can combine that kind of liberal critique of unfairness and corruption with also a redistributionist focus targeting unfair acquisitions by the super rich. And this is kind of getting very utopian now, but I thought I'd just try to finish on that utopian note. But thank you very much. Thank you.